Your ego is not your confidence. It is not your ambition. It is the silent force ruining your discipline, blinding your judgment, and sabotaging your future. Ego makes beginners talk instead of learn. Ego makes winners relax instead of work. Ego makes failures blame instead of adapt. This audiobook is not about thinking bigger, it's about getting smaller. Smaller ego, clearer thinking, stronger execution. If you don't control your ego, it will control you, and it will cost you everything. Chapter 1. Kill the need to be seen. You don't fail because you're incapable. You fail because you want to be seen before you're ready. Let's be clear from the start. The need to be seen is not ambition, it is ego. Ego demands attention before results. Discipline demands silence before mastery. That's the difference. Right now, most people are broadcasting progress instead of building it. Posting goals, announcing plans, talking about what they're about to do, but nothing is being done. You see it every day. Someone declares they're starting a business. They design a logo. They post a quote. They tell the world they're locked in. Then, 6 months later, nothing. No skill, no system, no results. Why? Because visibility feels like progress, but it isn't. Visibility before value is ego. That's the key. Your ego wants recognition now. Your discipline wants results later. And you have a choice. You can choose the short dopamine hit of attention or the long, quiet pain of disciplined work. You have a choice. Most people choose attention. That's why most people stay average. Let's talk about the trap. When you announce your goals publicly, your brain gets rewarded early. It gets the praise, the encouragement, the validation. But the work hasn't been done yet. So the hunger disappears, the urgency fades, the discipline weakens. You trick your nervous system into believing progress has already been made. That's not confidence. That's self-sabotage. It's not about motivation, it's about discipline. You don't need their permission. You don't need their approval. You don't need their applause. You need silence. Silence is where real work happens. Every master you admire built their foundation in obscurity. Not posting, not explaining, not proving. Practicing, training, failing quietly, correcting relentlessly. That's the part ego hates. Ego wants to skip the boring phase, the embarrassing phase, the invisible phase. But there is no mastery without invisibility. That's the key. If you need people to see you trying, you won't last long enough to win. Let me say that again. If you need people to see you trying, you won't last long enough to win. Because the moment praise disappears, you disappear with it. Discipline doesn't need witnesses. Ego does. So here's the first command of this audiobook. Stop announcing. Start executing. Stop explaining. Start practicing. Stop seeking attention. Start building value. You have a choice, and this choice shows up daily. Do you post about working out, or do you work out? Do you talk about learning, or do you study? Do you share quotes, or do you build skill? It's not about confidence, it's about discipline. Confidence comes after proof, not before. Real confidence is quiet. It doesn't argue, it doesn't advertise, it just performs. Look at your own behavior honestly. Where are you talking instead of training? Where are you posting instead of practicing? Where are you seeking validation instead of developing skill? That's where ego lives. And ego is expensive. It costs you focus. It costs you consistency. It costs you momentum. Because once you're seen, you feel pressure to perform at a level you haven't earned yet. So you fake it. You avoid challenges. You protect your image instead of improving your ability. That's the death spiral. Image over substance. Perception over progress. But discipline doesn't care how you look. It only cares how you execute. That's the key. Here's the behavioral shift. From today forward, you move in silence. No announcements, no declarations, no motivational speeches to people who aren't paying you. You work, you measure, you improve. You let results introduce you. This is uncomfortable. Good. Discomfort is the price of growth. Ego avoids discomfort. Discipline embraces it. When no one knows what you're building, you're free. Free to fail, free to experiment, free to be bad before you're good. That freedom is power. You don't need their permission to grow. You don't need their permission to struggle. You don't need their permission to improve. That's the key. Now, let's get practical. Here's what you stop doing immediately. You stop sharing goals publicly. You stop posting day one announcements. You stop explaining your plan to people who can't help execute it. And here's what you start doing. You track progress privately. You schedule daily practice. You set measurable standards. Not vibes, not motivation, standards. For example, instead of saying, "I'm starting a business," you work 2 hours a day building a skill that pays. Instead of saying, "I'm getting in shape," you train 5 days a week regardless of mood. Instead of saying, "I'm becoming disciplined," you follow a routine even when it's boring. That's discipline. It's not loud, it's not sexy, but it works. And here's the paradox. The less you try to be seen, the more undeniable you become. Because when results show up, they speak louder than any post ever could. Visibility earned through results is powerful. Visibility demanded by ego is weak. That's the difference. You have a choice. Be loud and average, or quiet and dangerous. Be visible without value, or invisible while building leverage. That's the key. This chapter is not about hiding forever. It's about earning visibility. There is a time to speak, but only after you've done the work. First, you master yourself, then you present the outcome. Never reverse that order. Because when ego leads, discipline dies. And without discipline, nothing lasts. So remember this rule. If you feel the urge to post, announce, or explain, pause. Ask yourself one question. Am I doing this to build value or to be seen? If it's to be seen, stop. Return to the work. That's how you win quietly. And once you win quietly, you win loudly without trying. That's the foundation. You killed the need to be seen. Now you must learn how to stay silent while sharpening your edge. You mastered the urge for attention. Now let's talk about the habit that separates amateurs from professionals. Chapter 2. Talk less, train more. Ego speaks, mastery listens. That's not poetry, that's physics. Noise consumes energy, focus compounds it. Most people talk themselves out of greatness. They explain, they justify, they narrate every step of the journey. And while they're talking, someone else is training. You see it everywhere. Beginners explain, experts practice. Beginners debate technique, experts repeat fundamentals. Beginners want to sound smart, experts want to get better. That's the line. Talking feels productive. Training actually is productive. That's the key. When you talk too much, you leak energy. When you train quietly, you store power. You have a choice. You can explain what you're doing, or you can do it. You can defend your potential, or you can develop skill. You have a choice. Let's be honest. Talking is easy. Training is hard. Talking gives instant relief. Training gives delayed results. Ego prefers relief. Discipline prefers results. It's not about intelligence, it's about discipline. Most people confuse articulation with competence. They think if they can explain it, they can execute it. That's false. Execution doesn't care how well you speak. It cares how well you repeat. Repetition builds skill. Skill builds confidence. Confidence silences doubt, not talk. That's the key. Look at your own habits honestly. How often do you explain what you're learning instead of practicing it? How often do you argue theory instead of testing it? How often do you speak about improvement instead of sweating through it? That gap is ego, and ego is loud. Ego wants to be heard now. Discipline wants results later. You have a choice. You can choose the short dopamine hit of attention or the long, quiet pain of disciplined work. You have a choice. Most people choose attention. That's why most people stay average. Annette. Now, let's get down to behavior. Here's what you stop doing. You stop over-explaining. You stop debating basics. You stop narrating your growth.
Chapter 3. Be a student longer than feels comfortable. Ego rushes graduation. Growth requires humility. That's the conflict. Ego wants the title. Growth wants the training. Ego wants to be seen as advanced. Growth wants to be effective. And the moment you stop learning, you start declining. That's not a motivational quote. That's a law. The world doesn't punish ignorance immediately. It punishes stagnation eventually. Most people don't fail because they're incapable. They fail because they decide they already know enough. They stop being students. And when learning stops, progress stops. When progress stops, decay begins. That's the key. Let's talk about the internal conflict. At some point, you start feeling too smart for the basics, too experienced to repeat fundamentals, too advanced to ask questions. That feeling is ego. Ego whispers, "You're past this. You already know this. You shouldn't have to learn this again." And that whisper is expensive, because mastery lives in repetition, not novelty. It's not about intelligence. It's about discipline. The basics are boring. That's why they work. The basics don't impress people. That's why ego avoids them. But fundamentals are where leverage lives. Every elite performer revisits basics constantly. Not because they forgot, because precision fades without practice. That's the key. You have a choice. You can protect your image as someone who knows, or you can protect your future by staying teachable. You have a choice. Most people choose image. That's why most people plateau. They graduate too early. They stop asking beginner questions. They stop accepting correction. They stop revisiting fundamentals. And slowly, quietly, they fall behind. The moment you stop learning, you start declining. Say it again. The moment you stop learning, you start declining. You may not notice it today, or next week, or next month, but the gap grows. Others improve while you maintain. Others sharpen while you coast. Others adapt while you defend old methods. That's how relevance dies. Ego hates the word student, because student implies incompleteness. But incompleteness is where growth begins. Mastery is not knowing everything. It's knowing what you still need to learn. That's the key. Let's break a dangerous myth. Experience does not equal expertise. Time served does not equal skill earned. You can repeat the same year of experience 10 times, or you can build 10 years of growth. The difference is humility. Humility says, I can improve this. I missed something. I need feedback. Ego says, I'm past this. I already know. That's beneath me. And ego blocks correction. Correction is uncomfortable. Correction exposes gaps. Correction threatens identity. But correction is how skill is built. It's not about talent. It's about discipline. Discipline keeps you learning after motivation fades. Discipline keeps you practicing basics after applause arrives. Discipline keeps you asking questions when ego wants silence. That's the key. Now let's talk about behavior. Here's what you stop doing. You stop assuming familiarity equals mastery. You stop skipping fundamentals. You stop resisting feedback because it bruises your pride. You stop saying, "I know." That phrase kills growth. And here's what you start doing. You revisit basics weekly. You study what you think you've already mastered. You ask better questions, not to look smart, but to get better. You seek correction intentionally. You invite critique from people who are ahead of you, not people who protect your feelings. That's discipline. You don't need their permission to be a beginner again. You don't need their permission to relearn fundamentals. You don't need their permission to admit gaps. That's the key. Now let's address the fear underneath ego. The fear is simple. If I'm still a student, maybe I'm not as good as I thought. Good. That realization is not weakness, it's accuracy. Accuracy is power. False confidence collapses under pressure. True confidence adapts. True confidence says, I can learn this. I can adjust. I can improve. That mindset survives failure. Ego does not. That's why ego rushes graduation. It wants certainty. But growth lives in uncertainty. You don't master uncertainty by pretending. You master it by training. And training requires humility. That's the key. Here's a rule to live by. If something feels too basic to practice, that's exactly what you need to practice. If feedback irritates you, that's where the gap is. If correction feels insulting, that's where ego is blocking growth. Pay attention to irritation. It's a signal. Irritation points to weakness. Weakness ignored becomes limitation. Weakness trained becomes strength. You have a choice. Ignore the signal or train the gap. You have a choice. Let's make this practical. For the next 30 days, choose one foundational skill in your life. Something basic, something unglamorous, and practice it deliberately. Not casually, not occasionally, daily. Measure progress, invite feedback, correct mistakes immediately. No shortcuts, no ego. If you think you're above this exercise, that's exactly what you needed. That's the key. Remember this. Every professional you admire stayed a student longer than their peers. They didn't rush status, they delayed graduation. While others chased recognition, they sought refinement. While others chased novelty, they sharpened fundamentals. And when pressure came, they didn't collapse, because their foundation was deep. That's what this chapter is about. Depth. Depth beats speed. Depth beats hype. Depth beats ego. The moment you stop learning, you start declining. So stay uncomfortable, stay curious, stay humble. Not forever, but long enough to become dangerous. You killed the need to be seen. You learned to talk less and train more. You stayed a student when ego wanted status. Now there's one more ego test. Because learning creates opportunity, and opportunity creates ambition. And ambition without discipline becomes ego again. You stayed humble long enough to grow. Now let's confront the trap that destroys progress when ambition runs ahead of discipline.
Chapter 5. Stop trying to win attention. Attention is rented. Skill is owned. That's not a metaphor. That's a warning. Ego craves validation. Purpose craves execution. And when attention becomes the goal, execution dies quietly. Most people today are not trying to get better. They are trying to be noticed. They chase likes. They chase praise. They chase titles. And while they chase attention, someone else is building skill. That's the key. Attention feels powerful, but it expires. Skill feels slow, but it compounds. Attention makes you visible. Skill makes you valuable. You have a choice. You can optimize for applause, or you can optimize for ability. You have a choice. Let's be honest about the pressure. Social pressure is constant. Post your wins, share your progress, announce your milestones. If you're not visible, people assume you're not moving. That assumption is poison, because real work is often invisible. And ego hates invisibility. Ego equates silence with failure. Discipline understands silence as incubation. That's the key. Look at how attention changes behavior. When attention is the goal, you start choosing actions that look good instead of actions that work. You pick optics over outcomes. You pick popularity over precision. You pick speed over depth. And slowly, quality erodes because attention rewards flash, not fundamentals. But fundamentals are what win long term. It's not about popularity, it's about discipline. Attention asks, how does this look? Discipline asks, how does this perform? Those questions lead to very different lives. That's the key. Here's the trap. Tension trains dependency. When likes drop, motivation drops. When praise disappears, effort fades. When recognition slows, consistency breaks. You become externally regulated. Your output depends on reaction. That's weakness. Discipline is internally regulated. You work because the work matters, not because someone noticed. You don't need their permission to work quietly. You don't need their permission to improve privately. You don't need their permission to delay recognition. That's the key. Let's expose the illusion. Attention does not equal respect. Noise does not equal impact. Being known does not mean being competent. In fact, many loud people are loud because they lack depth. They compensate with visibility. But skill doesn't compensate, it replaces. Skill walks into the room calm. It doesn't announce, it doesn't chase, it performs. Attention is rented. Skill is owned. Say it again. Attention is rented. Skill is owned. What you rent can be taken away. What you own compounds. Algorithms change. Trends die. Audiences move on. Skill stays. That's the key. Now let's talk behavior. Here's what you stop doing. You stop posting for validation. You stop measuring worth by engagement. You stop chasing titles that don't improve ability. You stop trying to look important. That's ego. And here's what you start doing. You invest in skills that pay dividends. You train fundamentals relentlessly. You track progress privately. You build leverage. Leverage doesn't need applause. It creates independence. That's discipline. For example, instead of posting quotes about success, you build a skill that produces income. Instead of chasing recognition at work, you become irreplaceably competent. Instead of collecting titles, you collect proof. That's the key. Here's a hard truth. Attention is a distraction disguised as opportunity. It feels like progress, but often it steals time from practice. Every hour spent chasing validation is an hour not spent building mastery. And mastery doesn't need marketing. It attracts. That's why the most dangerous people are often the quietest. They're not distracted by applause. They're not addicted to feedback. They're focused on performance. You have a choice. You can be visible and fragile, or invisible and formidable. You have a choice. Now let's address fear. Some people chase attention because they're afraid of being forgotten. They think, if I'm not seen, I don't exist. That's ego talking. Reality doesn't care about your visibility. It cares about your usefulness, and usefulness is built through skill. When you're useful, you're never irrelevant. That's the key. Attention fades, utility endures. So when you feel the urge to post, announce, or flex, pause. Ask yourself, is this building skill or feeding ego? If it feeds ego, stop. Return to the work. That pause is discipline. Discipline delays gratification. Ego demands it immediately. That's the difference. Let's make this concrete. For the next 30 days, reduce attention-seeking behaviors. Limit posting, limit explaining, increase skill-building hours, increase repetition, increase output quality. Track competence, not compliments. Measure progress by what you can do, not by what people say. That's discipline. You don't need their permission to disappear for a season. You don't need their permission to build quietly. You don't need their permission to delay recognition. That's the key. Remember this. Attention rewards who you appear to be. Skill rewards who you actually are. Attention inflates ego. Skill humbles and strengthens. Attention is rented. Skill is owned. And owned skill creates freedom. Freedom from approval, freedom from trends, freedom from dependence. That's the real win. You killed the need to be seen. You learned to talk less and train more. You stayed a student longer than comfort allowed. You disciplined ambition. You stopped chasing attention. Now comes the most dangerous moment. Because once
Chapter 7. Don't believe your own hype. Praise is noise. Results are truth. Say it again. Praise is noise. Results are truth. Ego listens to compliments. Discipline listens to data. That's the dividing line. The moment people start clapping, ego leans in. The moment numbers speak, discipline pays attention. And most people fail here. Not because they lack talent, not because they lack opportunity, but because they start believing their own hype. Success brings praise. Praise inflates ego. Ego kills consistency. That's the cycle. Overconfidence is not confidence. It's negligence. And negligence destroys momentum. That's the key. Let's be clear. Praise feels good. Encouragement feels validating. Recognition feels deserved. But feelings don't build results. Behavior does. And praise has a hidden cost. It shifts your attention away from execution and toward identity. You start thinking about who you are instead of what you're doing. I'm good at this. I've got this figured out. I'm naturally talented. That language is dangerous, because the moment identity replaces effort, effort declines. That's the key. Look at the real-world pattern. Someone gets praised for discipline, they relax their routine. Someone is told they're gifted, they stop practicing fundamentals. Someone is labeled a high performer, they stop tracking details. Overconfidence kills consistency. Every time. Because praise does not demand proof, results do. Praise asks nothing of you. Results demand repetition. It's not about confidence, it's about discipline. Discipline does not change because someone complimented you. Discipline asks one question only. What does the data say? That's the key. You have a choice. You can absorb praise emotionally, or you can filter it objectively. You have a choice. Ego absorbs praise and relaxes. Discipline acknowledges praise and returns to work. Ego says, I'm doing great. Discipline says, what can improve? That's the difference. Praise is external. Results are measurable. Praise fades. Results compound. That's why disciplined people stay grounded. They don't argue with data. They don't negotiate with numbers. They look at output. They look at consistency. They look at trends. And trends don't lie. Praise lies often. That's the key. Now let's talk about behavior. Here's what you stop doing. You stop replaying compliments in your head. You stop quoting praise as evidence of progress. You stop using recognition as justification to ease up. You stop believing words over numbers. That's ego. And here's what you start doing. You audit performance regularly. You track metrics. You measure execution. Not once, consistently. You ask hard questions. Am I improving or just being praised? Is output increasing or just visibility? Are trends trending up or is hype masking decline? That's discipline. You don't need their permission to ignore praise. You don't need their permission to stay skeptical. You don't need their permission to stay focused on data. That's the key. Let's address the emotional trap. Praise makes you feel safe, and safety kills urgency. When people tell you you're doing well, you feel less pressure to push. But pressure, controlled pressure, creates excellence. Remove pressure too early and standards slip. That's why elite performers distrust comfort. They enjoy praise briefly, then return to discomfort deliberately. Because discomfort keeps them sharp. That's discipline. Ego wants comfort. Discipline wants edge. That's the difference. Praise is noise. Results are truth. Say it again. Praise is noise. Results are truth. Truth doesn't care about your feelings. Truth shows you where you are. And where you are is not where you're going unless discipline stays intact. Now let's talk about humility. Humility is not self-doubt, it's accuracy. Accurate self-assessment is power. Ego inflates self-image. Discipline sharpens self-awareness. Self-awareness leads to correction. Correction leads to improvement. That's the key. Here's a rule. If praise increases faster than results, something is wrong. If attention grows but execution slips, ego is winning. If confidence rises but discipline weakens, you're in danger. Pay attention to mismatches. They're warnings. You have a choice. Ignore the warning or correct immediately. You have a choice. Let's make this practical. For the next 30 days, create a simple scoreboard. 1 to 3 metrics that define success in your life. Training sessions completed, hours of focused work, output produced. No opinions, no compliments, only numbers. Review weekly. If numbers improve, continue. If numbers stagnate, adjust. No excuses, no stories. That's discipline. When praise comes, and it will, acknowledge it politely. Then ask yourself one question. Did this change the work? If the answer is no, good. If the answer is yes, correct immediately. That pause is power. That's the key. Remember this. Praise does not mean arrival. Recognition does not mean mastery. Compliments do not equal competence. Only results speak truth. And results require repetition. Daily, boring, uncelebrated repetition. That's where real confidence is built. Confidence built on hype collapses. Confidence built on proof endures. You killed the need to be seen. You learned to talk less and train more. You stayed a student longer than comfort allowed. You disciplined ambition. You stopped chasing attention. You treated success as a test. You refused to believe your own hype. Now there's one more layer, because even with discipline, ego waits. It waits for comfort. It waits for routine. And then it softens you. You ignored praise and stayed grounded. Now let's learn how to stay sharp when comfort tries to dull your edge. Chapter 8. Stay dangerous by staying humble. Comfort is the enemy of greatness. Say it again. Comfort is the enemy of greatness. Ego makes you comfortable. Humility keeps you sharp. That's the line. The moment you start feeling settled, the moment you think, I've made it, you begin to dull. Not immediately, quietly. Sharp edges soften, standards slip, urgency fades, and ego smiles. Because ego doesn't need you weak, it only needs you comfortable. That's the key. Let's talk about the internal struggle. It sounds harmless. I'm doing well. I've earned this. I can relax a little. Those words feel reasonable. They are dangerous. Because growth does not survive comfort. Growth requires tension, pressure, demand. Comfort removes demand. And without demand, discipline erodes. That's the key. Ego says, you've arrived. Humility says, you're not finished. Ego wants rest as identity. Humility uses rest as recovery, then returns to work. That's the difference. You have a choice. You can interpret success as permission to slow down. Or you can treat it as a reminder to stay alert. You have a choice.
Chapter 9. Failure is feedback, not identity. Failure is an event, not a verdict. Say it again. Failure is an event, not a verdict. Ego personalizes failure. Growth studies it. That's the difference. Most people don't break because they failed. They break because they identify with the failure. They don't say, I failed. They say, I am a failure. That single shift destroys momentum. Because when failure becomes identity, correction feels pointless. That's the trap. Failure is information. Ego turns it into humiliation. Discipline turns it into instruction. That's the key. Let's be clear. Failure is unavoidable. If you are disciplined, you will fail often. Trying new things creates errors. Pushing limits exposes gaps. Raising standards increases mistakes. That's not weakness, that's growth. The only people who avoid failure are people who avoid effort. Ego avoids effort to avoid embarrassment. Discipline accepts embarrassment to gain skill. That's the difference. You have a choice. You can use failure as evidence against yourself, or you can use it as data for improvement. You have a choice. Most people choose identity. Very few choose analysis.
and analysis is where power lives. That's the key. Let's talk about the common pattern. Someone fails once. They feel exposed. They feel embarrassed. Instead of adjusting, they quit. Instead of correcting, they withdraw. They protect ego by abandoning growth. That's not self-respect, that's fear. Ego says, if I try again and fail, it confirms something is wrong with me. Discipline says, if I fail again, I'll learn faster. One leads to stagnation, the other leads to mastery. Failure is an event, not a verdict. Say it again. Failure is an event, not a verdict. Events pass, verdicts imprison. Don't imprison yourself. Now let's expose a lie. People think successful individuals fail less. Wrong. They fail more, they just fail better. They don't dramatize failure. They don't internalize it. They don't broadcast it. They dissect it. They ask questions. What broke? Why did it break? What do I change next time? That's discipline. Ego asks a different question. What does this say about me? That question leads nowhere. It produces shame. Shame produces avoidance. Avoidance kills progress. That's the key. You don't need their permission to fail forward. You don't need their permission to try again. You don't need their permission to be bad before you're good. That's the key. Let's bring this to behavior. Here's what you stop doing. You stop using failure as a reason to quit. You stop replaying mistakes emotionally. You stop attaching your self-worth to outcomes. You stop saying, I'm just not good at this. That sentence ends growth. And here's what you start doing. You separate identity from outcome. You failed at a task. You did not fail as a person. You document the failure. You extract lessons. You adjust behavior. Then you repeat. That's discipline. For every failure, you ask 3 questions. What did I do? What happened? What will I do differently next time? No drama, no judgment, just data. That's the key. Here's another truth. Failure hurts more when ego is strong, because ego needs to look capable. Failure threatens that image, but humility absorbs failure easily. Humility expects imperfection. Humility welcomes correction. That's why humility recovers faster. They don't protect an image, they protect progress. It's not about confidence, it's about discipline. Discipline stays intact after failure. Ego collapses. That's the difference. Now let's talk about timing. Failure feels urgent. Correction feels slow. So people quit because they want the pain to end immediately. But quitting doesn't end pain, it delays it. Because the same weakness shows up later, stronger. Correction hurts once. Avoidance hurts forever. That's the key. You have a choice. You can absorb short-term discomfort, or you can accept long-term regret. You have a choice. Failure is not the enemy. Misinterpretation is. Failure is feedback. Feedback tells you where to focus. Feedback shows you what to train. Ignoring feedback guarantees repetition. That's why quitting is expensive. It keeps the weakness alive. Now let's address fear. Some people fear failure because they fear judgment. They imagine others watching, laughing, remembering. Reality is harsher and simpler. Most people are too busy with their own failures to track yours. And even if they judge, their opinion doesn't change your ability. Only your behavior does. You don't need their permission to fail forward. You don't need their permission to adjust publicly. You don't need their permission to keep going. That's the key. Now let's make this practical. For the next 30 days, track failures deliberately. Not to shame yourself, to study patterns. Write them down. What happened? What triggered it? What behavior led there? Then adjust one variable, not everything, one thing. That's how growth compounds. Small corrections, repeated consistently. That's the key. Remember this. Failure is temporary. Lessons are permanent, if you keep them. Ego wants to erase failure. Discipline wants to extract value from it. That's the difference. Failure is an event, not a verdict. Say it one last time. Failure is an event, not a verdict. You killed the need to be seen. You learned to talk less and train more. You stayed a student longer than comfort allowed. You disciplined ambition. You stopped chasing attention. You treated success as a test. You ignored praise. You stayed humble to stay sharp. You learned to use failure as feedback. Now there's one final responsibility. Because growth without ownership collapses. And ego avoids ownership at all costs. You learn to fail without breaking. Now let's talk about the habit that ends excuses forever. Chapter 10. Stop blaming, start adjusting. Ownership creates power. Say it again. Ownership creates power. Ego defends mistakes. Discipline fixes them. That's the difference. Most people don't fail because they lack opportunity. They fail because they outsource responsibility. They blame timing. They blame people. They blame systems. They blame luck. Blame feels relieving. Adjustment feels demanding. Ego chooses relief. Discipline chooses results. That's the key. Blame freezes progress. Ownership moves it forward. Because you can't change what you don't own. And ego hates ownership. Ownership removes excuses. Ownership removes comfort. Ownership removes the option to complain. That's why ego resists it. But discipline embraces ownership because ownership creates control. That's the key. Let's talk about the real-world pressure. Things go wrong. Plans break. People disappoint. Conditions change. And in that moment, you have a choice. You can explain why it wasn't your fault, or you can adjust. You have a choice. Most people explain. They tell stories. They justify outcomes. They point outward. That does nothing. Adjustment changes outcomes. That's the difference. Ego wants to be right. Discipline wants to be effective. Being right doesn't move you forward. Being effective does. It's not about fairness. It's about discipline. The world does not reward fairness. It rewards adaptability. That's the key. Here's a hard truth. Every excuse is a delay. Every explanation without adjustment pushes progress further away. Because excuses preserve the ego, adjustments improve performance. That's why ownership is power. Ownership says, this happened, what now? No emotion, no blame, just response. That's discipline. You don't need their permission to take responsibility. You don't need their permission to fix problems. You don't need their permission to adjust even when it wasn't your fault. That's the key. Let's break a dangerous mindset. If it's not my fault, it's not my problem. That mindset keeps people average forever. Because power comes from responsibility, not innocence. You can be right and stuck, or wrong and progressing. Choose progress.
Chapter 11. Anonymous work builds real strength. Do the work even when no one is watching. Say it again. Do the work even when no one is watching. Ego wants credit. Legacy wants results. That's the difference. Most people work hard when they're observed. They relax when they're alone. That tells you everything. Discipline doesn't require an audience. Ego does. Real strength is built in anonymity. The hours no one sees, the reps no one counts, the corrections no one applauds.
That's where advantage is created. That's the key. Let's be clear. If your effort depends on recognition, your output will always be inconsistent, because recognition is unpredictable, but discipline must be constant. Unseen effort compounds quietly. Seen effort often performs for the moment. That's the difference. You have a choice. You can work for applause, or you can work for outcomes. You have a choice. Applause is temporary. Outcomes endure. Legacy is built in private, not on display. Ego wants witnesses. Discipline wants standards. That's the key. Look at the real-world pattern. The loud worker posts progress. The quiet worker produces results. The loud worker explains. The quiet worker executes. The loud worker looks busy. The quiet worker becomes dangerous. Unseen effort outperforms loud effort every time. Because loud effort leaks energy. Anonymous work concentrates it. That's the key. Here's the uncomfortable truth. If you only perform when watched, you are not disciplined. You are compliant. Compliance depends on oversight. Discipline does not. Discipline works alone. You don't need their permission to work quietly. You don't need their permission to stay anonymous. You don't need their permission to delay recognition. That's the key. Now let's talk behavior. Here's what you stop doing. You stop announcing effort. You stop documenting every rep. You stop seeking validation for consistency. You stop turning work into performance. That's ego. And here's what you start doing. You create private standards. You track effort personally. You hold yourself accountable when no one else will. That's discipline. For example, you train even when no one knows. You study even when no one checks. You execute even when there's no reward. That's real strength. Because strength built privately doesn't collapse publicly. That's the key. Let's address motivation. People think anonymity kills motivation. It does for ego. But discipline doesn't need motivation. It needs commitment. Commitment is internal. Motivation is external. External fuel runs out. Internal structure endures. That's the difference. Anonymous work builds trust with yourself. Every time you show up without applause, you reinforce identity. Not the identity of someone who tries, the identity of someone who does. That identity is unshakable. That's the key. Now let's confront fear. Some people avoid anonymous work because they fear their effort might not matter. They want reassurance before investing energy. But reassurance comes after proof, not before. Proof is built in silence. Silence is uncomfortable, but silence is fertile. That's where momentum grows. Ego wants visibility to feel real. Discipline knows reality doesn't require witnesses. That's the difference. Do the work even when no one is watching. Say it again. Do the work even when no one is watching. Now let's make this practical. For the next 30 days, choose one discipline, one habit, one skill, and remove all external validation from it. No posting, no announcing, no explaining. Just execution. Track it privately. Measure it honestly. At the end of 30 days, you won't need encouragement. You'll have confidence. Because confidence comes from kept promises, not from praise. That's the key. Remember this. The strongest people you admire did their most important work in obscurity, before recognition, before success, before approval. They built leverage quietly, and when the world finally noticed, they were already prepared. That's why anonymous work builds real strength, because it removes dependency. Dependency on praise, dependency on motivation, dependency on approval. And independence is power. You have a choice. You can be loud and fragile, or quiet and unbreakable. You have a choice. Ego wants to be seen trying.
Discipline wants to be undeniable. Undeniable doesn't argue, it doesn't explain, it shows results. That's the key. Do the work even when no one is watching. Not sometimes, always. Because when pressure arrives and eyes turn towards you, you will not rise to the occasion, you will fall to the level of your private discipline. And if your private discipline is strong, you will stand. You killed the need to be seen. You learned to talk less and train more. You stayed a student longer than comfort allowed. You disciplined ambition. You stopped chasing attention. You treated success as a test. You ignored praise. You stayed humble. You used failure as feedback. You took ownership. You worked anonymously. Now there is only one final step. Because ego never fully disappears, it must be managed daily. You learned to work without witnesses. Now let's end this journey with the discipline that keeps ego permanently in check. Chapter 12. Mastery requires ego death. Less ego, more control. Say it again. Less ego, more control. Ego wants to feel important. Mastery wants to be effective. That is the final conflict. Everything you've learned so far leads here. Because ego never fully disappears, it only changes shape. And if you don't manage it, it will sabotage you at the highest level. That's the key. Let's be clear. Ego death does not mean self-hatred. It does not mean weakness. It does not mean thinking small. It means removing self-image from the equation. Because self-image is fragile, and fragility kills mastery. Mastery does not protect identity. It protects execution. That's the difference. Ego asks, how do I look? Mastery asks, what works? Ego wants to be admired. Mastery wants to be accurate. Ego wants to feel special. Mastery wants to be reliable. Less ego, more control. That's the key. The final internal conflict is this: letting go of the version of yourself that needs recognition. Letting go of the version of yourself that needs to be right. Letting go of the version of yourself that needs to win arguments instead of outcomes. That version must die. Because mastery cannot coexist with self-protection. Self-protection avoids feedback. Self-protection avoids correction. Self-protection avoids discomfort. Mastery runs directly into all three. That's the key. You have a choice. You can preserve your ego or build mastery. You have a choice. Preserving ego feels safe. Building mastery feels exposed. Exposure is necessary. Because only exposed systems can be improved. Only exposed weaknesses can be trained. Only exposed effort can be refined. That's discipline. It's not about pride, it's about precision. Precision requires honesty. Honesty requires humility. Humility requires ego death. That's the chain. Let's say it clearly. As long as your identity is attached to outcomes, you will avoid risks. As long as your worth depends on success, you will fear failure. As long as you need to look capable, you will avoid being corrected. That's ego. And ego caps performance. Less ego, more control. Say it again. Less ego, more control. Mastery removes the need to prove. There is no proving, only refining. There is no defending, only adjusting. There is no image, only output. That's mastery. Ego wants to arrive. Mastery commits to the process. Arrival is an illusion. There is no finish line, only standards. Standards rise, standards sharpen, and ego hates rising standards. Because rising standards demand constant humility. That's the key. You don't need their permission to let go of your ego. You don't need their permission to be wrong. You don't need their permission to rebuild yourself at a higher level. That's the key. Now let's talk behavior. Here's what ego death looks like in action. You stop taking feedback personally. You stop defending mistakes emotionally. You stop needing credit for effort. You become quiet under pressure. You become curious under criticism. You become calm under challenge. That's mastery.
Chapter 13. Control your emotions, or they will control you. Your emotions are not the problem. Your obedience to them is. That's the truth. Ego reacts. Discipline responds. Emotion is information, not instruction. And the moment you treat emotion as command, you lose control. That's the key. Most people think emotional control means suppression. It doesn't. It means delay. It means not acting immediately, not speaking immediately, not deciding immediately. Because emotion is temporary, but decisions are permanent. You have a choice. You can obey emotion, or you can observe it. You have a choice. Ego reacts fast. Discipline waits. Waiting creates clarity. Clarity creates power. That's the key. Look at every major regret. Anger spoken too fast. Fear acted on too early. Excitement trusted too quickly. Emotion hijacked reason, and ego justified it. It felt right. I had to respond. I couldn't let that slide. That's ego. It's not about feelings. It's about discipline. Disciplined people feel deeply, but act deliberately. That's mastery. Now let's talk behavior. Here's what you stop doing. You stop reacting immediately. You stop speaking from emotion. You stop deciding under pressure. And here's what you start doing. You insert a pause. A pause between feeling and action. A pause between stimulus and response. That pause is control. That's the key. Anger passes. Fear fades. Impulse weakens. But discipline remains. You don't need their permission to stay calm. You don't need their permission to step back. You don't need their permission to choose silence. That's the key. Here's the rule. If emotion is high, action must be slow. If emotion is intense, decision must wait. That's discipline. You have a choice. React and regret, or pause and dominate. You have a choice. This chapter teaches control, and control is power. You learned to master ego. Now you must master emotion. But mastery also requires direction. Chapter 14. Focus is a discipline, not a feeling. Focus is not motivation. Focus is structure. Waiting to feel focused is how most people stay distracted. Ego chases stimulation. Discipline chooses direction. That's the difference. Focus is built, not found. You don't drift into focus, you design it. That's the key. Distraction is not accidental. It is allowed. Every notification you don't disable, every boundary you don't enforce, every task you don't prioritize, that's a choice. You have a choice. You can let the world interrupt you, or you can defend your attention. You have a choice. Attention is your most valuable asset. What you focus on grows. What you ignore fades. That's the law. Ego wants novelty. Discipline wants depth. Depth creates leverage. Now let's talk behavior. Here's what you stop doing. You stop multitasking. You stop reacting to everything. You stop confusing busy with productive. And here's what you start doing. You schedule focus. You remove distractions. You work in blocks. Single task, single target, single standard. That's discipline. Focus is not intensity. It's consistency. 30 minutes of real focus beats 3 hours of scattered effort. That's the key. You don't need their permission to say no.
You don't need their permission to be unavailable. You don't need their permission to protect your mind. That's the key. This chapter builds direction because discipline without focus becomes wasted effort. You learned to control emotion. You learned to direct attention. Now comes the final test. Chapter 15. Live like you're being watched by the future. One day, the noise will stop. The opinions, the pressure, the distractions, and you'll be left with one thing: your habits. Your future self is watching you right now, not judging, measuring. Every choice you make today becomes your future's foundation. That's the key. Ego lives in the moment. Discipline lives in the future. Ego asks, what do I want now? Discipline asks, what will this cost later? That question changes everything. You have a choice. You can live for relief or live for respect from your future self. You have a choice. Every shortcut is a debt. Every discipline is an investment. And time collects interest. That's the key. Now let's talk identity. The strongest people don't ask, what do I feel like doing? They ask, what would my future self thank me for? That question creates discipline. It removes emotion. It removes ego. It creates clarity. You don't need their permission to think long term. You don't need their permission to sacrifice comfort. You don't need their permission to live deliberately. That's the key. Here's your final command. Before every decision, ask, does this build the future I want or steal from it? Then act accordingly. That's mastery. You killed the ego. You built discipline. You chose control over comfort. This audiobook ends here, but the work does not, because mastery is not achieved. It is maintained daily, quietly, relentlessly.
Chapter 16. Discipline is who you are, not what you do. Discipline is not something you do. It is something you are. That's the shift most people never make. They treat discipline like an activity, a task, a phase, something they try when motivated. That never lasts. Because actions depend on mood, but identity does not. That's the key. Ego asks every morning, how do I feel today? Discipline asks, who am I, regardless? You have a choice. You can negotiate with yourself every day. Or you can decide once who you are. You have a choice. Most people wake up and renegotiate their standards. They argue with themselves. I'll do it later. I'll skip today. I'll make up for it tomorrow. That internal debate is ego. Discipline ends the debate. When discipline becomes identity, there is no argument. You act. It's not about motivation. It's about discipline. Motivation fluctuates. Identity does not. That's the key. Let's be honest. The reason most people fail at consistency is because they haven't decided who they are. They say, I'm trying to be disciplined. Trying is temporary. Identity is permanent. You don't try to brush your teeth. You don't try to show up to work. You do it because that's who you are. Discipline must reach that level. That's the goal. Ego wants flexibility. Discipline wants standards. Ego wants options. Discipline wants rules. Rules remove emotion. Rules remove negotiation. That's why discipline works. It's not about willpower, it's about identity. That's the key. Now let's expose the flaw. Most people build habits without identity. They copy routines. They follow plans. They watch motivational content, but they never change self-image. So the moment pressure comes, the habit collapses.
Because habits without identity have no spine. Identity creates spine. Identity says, I am someone who finishes what they start. I am someone who trains even when tired. I am someone who does not negotiate with weakness. Those statements change behavior automatically. You don't need motivation. You don't need hype. You act because that's who you are. That's the key. You have a choice. You can keep asking, do I feel like it? Or you can ask, what would someone like me do? You have a choice. Now let's talk transformation. Here's what you stop doing. You stop saying, I'll try. You stop saying, I'm working on being disciplined. You stop saying, I'm inconsistent. Those phrases reinforce weakness. Language shapes identity, and identity shapes action. That's the key. Here's what you start doing. You define non-negotiables. Not goals, standards. Standards are behaviors you follow regardless of mood. For example, I train 5 days a week. I start my work at the same time daily. I do not quit when it gets boring. No emotion, no excuses. That's discipline. Then you internalize it. You stop saying, I should. You say, I do. Because that's who you are. You don't need their permission to redefine yourself. You don't need their permission to raise standards. You don't need their permission to become dangerous. That's the key. Now let's address resistance. Your old identity will fight back. It will feel uncomfortable, foreign, rigid. Good. That discomfort is ego dying. Ego thrives on flexibility. Discipline thrives on structure. When you feel resistance, that's proof you're changing identity. Most people quit here. They mistake discomfort for failure. But discomfort is transition. That's the key. Discipline as identity removes emotional decision-making. You no longer ask, should I? You ask, what's next? That saves energy. And energy saved compounds. That's why disciplined people look calm. They're not fighting themselves all day. They decided once, now they execute. It's not about perfection, it's about alignment. When actions align with identity, consistency becomes automatic. That's mastery. Now let's make this practical. For the next 30 days, you will do one thing. You will write a discipline identity statement. Not motivational, not emotional, operational. For example, I am someone who trains daily without negotiation. I am someone who completes tasks before relaxing. I am someone who shows up even when tired. Pick one statement. Live by it. No exceptions, no explanations. When ego whispers excuses, you respond with identity. This is what I do. That's the key. Over time, your brain stops resisting, because repetition rewires identity. And once identity shifts, discipline stops feeling hard. It becomes normal. Effort becomes default. That's the real win. Remember this. Motivation is borrowed. Discipline is owned. Habits fade. Identity endures. You don't rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the level of who you believe you are. So choose wisely. You killed the ego. You built discipline. Now you anchored it into identity. But identity faces one final enemy: monotony. Because once discipline becomes routine, boredom arrives. And boredom destroys more people than fear ever will. Chapter 17. Boredom is the final boss. Boredom kills more dreams than fear ever will. Fear feels dangerous. Boredom feels harmless. That's why boredom wins. Ego can fight fear. Ego cannot survive monotony. Discipline can. That's the key. Most people don't quit when things are hard. They quit when things are repetitive. Same routine, same effort, same standards, day after day. And ego whispers, "This isn't exciting anymore. This should feel better by now. There must be something more." That whisper ends careers. Boredom is not a problem. It is a test. The final test. You have a choice. You can chase stimulation, or you can stay consistent. You have a choice. Let's get something straight. If you only work when inspired, you are not disciplined. You are entertained. Entertainment fades. Discipline endures. That's the difference. Boredom appears when novelty disappears, and novelty disappearing means you're finally doing the work long enough for it to matter. That's the key. Most people misinterpret boredom. They think boredom means something is wrong. It doesn't. Boredom means the routine is working. The chaos is gone. The learning curve has flattened. The work is now about refinement, and ego hates refinement, because refinement requires patience, and patience does not give dopamine. Ego wants highs. Discipline accepts flat lines. Flat lines are where mastery lives. That's the key. Look at any elite performer. Their training is boring. Their schedule is predictable. Their habits are repetitive. Not exciting, effective. Beginners chase excitement. Professionals chase precision. Precision is boring. That's why few reach mastery. You have a choice. You can seek excitement and restart forever, or endure boredom and compound progress. You have a choice. Now let's expose the real danger. When boredom sets in, ego looks for escape, new plans, new routines, new strategies. Not because the old one failed, but because the ego is uncomfortable with repetition. So people reset. They change systems. They change goals. They change identities. And they start from zero again. That's not growth. That's avoidance. It's not about lack of progress. It's about lack of discipline. That's the key. Discipline says, "I will repeat this until it works." Ego says, "I need something new." New feels productive, but repetition is productive. That's the truth. Now let's talk behavior. Here's what you stop doing. You stop changing routines because you're bored. You stop chasing motivation. You stop mistaking monotony for stagnation. You stop saying, "I'm not feeling it anymore." Feeling is irrelevant. And here's what you start doing. You commit to boredom. You show up even when nothing feels rewarding. You execute even when progress feels invisible. You trust the process even when emotion disappears. That's discipline. Discipline does not need excitement. It needs commitment. That's the key. You don't need their permission to be bored. You don't need their permission to stay consistent. You don't need their permission to repeat what works. That's the key. Let's address the psychological pressure. Boredom triggers doubt. Is this still worth it? Am I wasting time? Shouldn't I be further along? Those thoughts are normal. They are not commands. You acknowledge them, then you return to the work. That pause, that refusal to act on boredom is where power is built. Because boredom is the gatekeeper. On the other side of boredom is mastery. Most people turn back. You don't. That's the difference. Now let's make this practical. For the next 30 days, you will not change your core routine, no matter how bored you feel. Same time, same structure, same standards. You will not add excitement. You will not seek novelty. You will execute. Track results, not feelings. If results are improving, you stay. If results are declining, you adjust slightly. not emotionally, strategically. That's discipline. Boredom is not the signal to quit, it's the signal to refine. Refine timing, refine technique, refine focus, but do not abandon structure. That's the key. Remember this. Boredom means ego is starving, and ego starving is good. Ego feeds on stimulation. Discipline feeds on repetition. The longer you stay bored and consistent, the weaker ego becomes. Eventually, boredom disappears, not because work becomes exciting, but because identity stabilizes. You no longer need emotion. You operate. That's mastery. You turned discipline into identity. Now you survived boredom. But there's another trap ahead, because once consistency produces results, pressure increases, expectations rise, eyes return, and pressure exposes weakness. You survived boredom. Now you must learn how to perform when pressure arrives.
Chapter 18. Pressure reveals who you really are. Pressure does not create character. It reveals it. Say it again. Pressure does not create character. It reveals it. When things are calm, anyone can look disciplined. When stakes are low, anyone can stay composed. But pressure strips away performance. It exposes truth. That's the key. Ego performs when conditions are comfortable. Discipline performs when conditions are hostile. Pressure is the audit. And most people fail the audit. Not because they are weak, but because they built discipline that only works when life is easy. That kind of discipline is fake. Real discipline survives pressure. You have a choice. You can train only for comfort, or you can train for pressure. You have a choice. Let's be honest. Pressure will come. Deadlines, judgment, loss, responsibility. And when it comes, you will not rise to the occasion. You will fall to the level of your preparation. That's the key. Pressure exposes habits. Under pressure, you don't think clearly. You default. You default to your routines. You default to your standards. You default to who you really are. That's why pressure is honest. It doesn't care about intention. It doesn't care about potential. It reveals behavior. Ego collapses under pressure. Discipline stabilizes. That's the difference. Look at how people behave when pressure hits. They rush, they react, they panic, they abandon structure. Why? Because their discipline was conditional. It worked when they felt good. It disappeared when they felt threatened. That's not discipline. That's convenience. It's not about confidence. It's about discipline. Discipline does not spike under pressure. It simplifies. That's the key. Under pressure, disciplined people do fewer things, better. They return to fundamentals. They reduce noise. They protect structure. Ego does the opposite. Ego adds chaos. Ego seeks shortcuts. Ego tries to impress. And that always backfires. You have a choice. You can let pressure rush you, or you can let pressure focus you. You have a choice. Now let's talk behavior. Here's what you stop doing under pressure. You stop changing plans impulsively. You stop explaining emotionally. You stop trying to look calm. You stop performing. And here's what you start doing. You slow down. You reduce decisions. You follow your pre-built systems. That's why systems matter. Systems remove emotion. Systems remove panic. Systems remove ego. That's discipline. Pressure does not require intensity. It requires clarity. Clarity comes from preparation. That's the key. Let's address the internal fear. Pressure triggers identity threat. What if I fail? What if I'm exposed? What if I'm not as good as they think? Those thoughts are normal. They are not commands. Discipline acknowledges fear, then executes anyway.
Ego tries to eliminate fear. Discipline works through it. That's the difference. You don't need their permission to slow down under pressure. You don't need their permission to stick to basics. You don't need their permission to choose structure over speed. That's the key. Here's a rule. When pressure increases, complexity must decrease. Simplify. Fewer tasks, clear priorities, strict routines. Pressure punishes improvisation. It rewards preparation. That's why elite performers look calm. Not because they're fearless, because they're structured. Structure creates stability. Stability creates control. That's the key. Now let's make this practical. For the next 30 days, you will pressure-proof your discipline. You do this by training under controlled stress, slight discomfort, time limits, higher standards. Not chaos, controlled pressure. You practice showing up tired. You practice executing when distracted. You practice sticking to routine when stressed. So when real pressure comes, it feels familiar. That's discipline. Pressure is not the enemy. Unpreparedness is. Pressure reveals who you really are. Make sure what it reveals is someone disciplined. You turned discipline into identity. You survived boredom. You learned to perform under pressure. Now there is one final challenge, because even the disciplined can break if they don't know when to stop. You learned to stand strong under pressure. Now let's talk about the discipline of recovery.
Chapter 19. Time is the only currency that matters. Time is the only currency you never earn back. Money returns. Status fades and reappears. Opportunities come and go. Time only goes. That's the key. Ego wastes time. Discipline invests it. And the difference between average and exceptional is not talent. It's how time is used. Every life is paid for in hours. The question is simple. What are you buying? You have a choice. You can spend time for relief or invest time for results. You have a choice. Most people don't respect time because time feels abundant until it isn't. They assume tomorrow is guaranteed. They assume they'll get serious later. They assume there's room to waste today. That assumption ruins lives. Time doesn't warn you. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care about intention. It only records usage. That's the key. Ego treats time casually. Discipline treats time deliberately. Ego asks, how do I feel right now? Discipline asks, what is this hour for? That question changes everything. Because when time has purpose, distraction loses power. Now let's expose the real problem. Most people don't lack time, they lack clarity. They say, I don't have time. What they mean is, I didn't choose this. Time is not stolen, it is traded. Every scroll is a trade. Every delay is a trade. Every excuse is a trade. And most trades are terrible. That's the key. It's not about being busy. Busy is meaningless. Busy people waste time efficiently. Discipline creates direction, not busyness. Direction tells time where to go. That's the difference. You don't need more time, you need fewer priorities. Ego wants options. Discipline chooses focus. Focus turns time into leverage. That's the key. Let's talk behavior. Here's what you stop doing. You stop killing time. You stop filling gaps. You stop treating free hours as disposable. There is no free time, only unassigned time. Unassigned time gets stolen. That's ego. And here's what you start doing. You assign every hour a role. Work, training, recovery, learning. not rigid, intentional. You don't micromanage time, you respect it. That's discipline. Here's a rule. If you don't decide how to use time, something else will, and it will not choose wisely. That's the key. Now let's address fear. Some people avoid structure because structure exposes waste. When you track time, you see reality. Where effort leaks, where focus dies, where comfort dominates. Ego avoids that truth. Discipline demands it. Because awareness creates control. Less ego, more control. That's the key. Time reveals priorities. Not what you say matters, what you spend time on matters. That's honesty. You don't need their permission to value your time. You don't need their permission to protect your hours. You don't need their permission to say no. That's the key. Now let's make this practical. For the next 30 days, you will audit your time. Not perfectly, honestly. At the end of each day, ask, what did I invest time in? Did it build skill, strength, or stability? Or did it only provide relief? No judgment, just truth. Then you adjust. You remove low-return activities. You protect high-return blocks. Not everything at once, 1 hour at a time. That's discipline. Here's the hard truth. Your future is already being built by how you spend today. Not tomorrow, today. Every disciplined hour compounds. Every wasted hour charges interest. Time is the only currency that matters because it buys everything else. Health, skill, freedom, peace. Spend it wisely. You turned discipline into identity. You survived boredom. You performed under pressure. You learned when to rest. You learned to respect time. Now there is only one chapter left. Because once you master time, there is one responsibility remaining: to live in a way that requires no applause. You learn to value time. Now let's end with the discipline that defines legacy.
One day, you will look back at who you used to be, and you will barely recognize that person. Not because you became someone else, but because you finally became who you were supposed to be. That's the goal. Not improvement, transformation. Not progress, replacement. You are not here to tweak your old life. You are here to outgrow it. That's the key. Most people want change without loss. They want new results without letting go of old habits. They want growth without discomfort. That never works. To become disciplined, your old self must be left behind. Not negotiated with, not slowly faded, left behind. That's the truth. Your old self lives in excuses, in delays, in comfort. Your new self lives in standards, in structure, in silence. And you have a choice. You can keep revisiting who you were, or you can commit to who you are becoming. You have a choice. Transformation begins when nostalgia ends. As long as you protect your old identity, you will sabotage your future one. That's the key. Let's be clear. Your old self is not evil. It was necessary. It got you here, but it cannot take you further. Every level demands a different version of you, and the cost of the next level is the version you are right now. That's discipline. Discipline says, this version of me is no longer acceptable, not emotionally, operationally. You raise standards, you remove options, you change behavior, and behavior changes identity. That's the key. Ego resists this chapter because ego wants continuity. I'm still the same person. This is just a phase. I'll relax later. No, this is not a phase. This is a line. Before and after. You don't visit discipline, you move in. You don't try to change, you decide to. You don't need their permission to outgrow your past. You don't need their permission to disappoint people who liked the old you. You don't need their permission to become disciplined. That's the key. Let's talk about separation. At some point, your habits will no longer match your old environment. Your silence will confuse people. Your consistency will threaten them. Your discipline will make them uncomfortable. That's normal. Growth creates distance, not because you're better, but because you're different. Different standards, different pace, different priorities. You don't explain this. You don't defend it. You live it. That's mastery. Here's the truth most people avoid. If everyone around you is comfortable with who you are, you haven't changed enough. Real change is quiet and inconvenient. That's the key. Now let's talk behavior. Here's what you stop doing permanently. You stop negotiating with weakness. You stop romanticizing your past. You stop returning to old habits just this once. Old patterns don't disappear. They wait. One exception becomes a habit again. Discipline is not fragile, but it is precise. Precision requires boundaries, and boundaries require courage. That's discipline. And here's what you start doing. You act like the person you're becoming, even when it feels unnatural. You keep promises to yourself. You show up without hype. You do the work without witnesses. You choose long-term respect over short-term relief. Every day. That's identity. That's the key. Let's bring this home. You didn't listen to this audiobook to feel inspired. You listened to change. And change is not emotional. It's behavioral. If nothing changes after this, then nothing changes. But if one habit locks in, one standard rises, one excuse dies, your life shifts. Quietly, irreversibly. That's discipline. So here is your final command. Do not return to who you were. Not when tired, not when bored, not when no one is watching. You already know what comfort costs you. Choose differently. Choose discipline. Choose silence. Choose structure. Choose consistency. Become someone your old self could never keep up with. Less ego, more control. And that is how mastery is lived.